Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 1 today as David continues his conversation with the man who's come from the battle with torn clothes and dirt on his head. And as we do, I won't repeat what I did in the introductory video to 2 Samuel, but I'd really encourage you, if you haven't watched that, to watch it so that you can be aware of some of the issues that are involved not just in this scene, but throughout 2 Samuel, in terms of whether we can trust David's perspective here as honest, whether the authors or the narrator are pro or anti-David or pro and anti-monarchy, as well as some of the other details, like how this section fits in and when it might have been written. No specific answers to those questions. As I said at the beginning of the last video, an article by a scholar recently noted a number of different scholars who try to find an outline for 2 Samuel and 1 Samuel together in a wide variety of ways, no two of which agree. So we don't necessarily have a tight structure, and we don't necessarily have answers to how 2 Samuel fits in with the rest of the Deuteronomistic history from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, but we'll be pointing out some of the evidence along the way. So what we need to be aware of right now as we look at this scene is how this is continuous what we saw at the end of chapter 31 in 1 Samuel, but we'll get to that in just a second. So as you can see on the right side of the screen in the key words, one of the elements that is important in this first part is that the person that David is talking to is identified 3 times, twice today and once in the next video, as simply the young man who is reporting to him, highlighting the language of reporting. That what's going on here is all about whether we trust various reports, whether we trust this man's report, who turns out to be the son of an Amalekite resident alien in Israel, or whether we trust David's response, whether we trust in the writer's response, and whether we trust the overall Deuteronomistic history. And there are scholars who distrust various elements of that along the way, and some who trust it all. So we have to make a decision for ourselves. And again, I'll try to point out the evidence as we go. One of the issues here is this is the second of 3 reports in the Bible of Saul's death. The third one is in Chronicles, and we're not going to look at that one because Chronicles is a very different rewrite of 1 and 2 Samuel for a variety of reasons, mostly to clean it up and to point not toward the monarchy, but to the monarchy as a vehicle for establishing the Jerusalem temple, which is the central theme of the books of Chronicles. But what's important now is to compare the one we have here with the one we saw at the end of 1 Samuel here. But one of the elements is we as readers have seen this report in 31:2-6, but David hasn't. We have no reason to know David knows this story, although the aftermath of this story involved the cutting off of their heads and the bringing them back to David and elements like that. But of course they don't end up bringing it back to David, they bring it to Jabesh. But David certainly must know about that. And so we don't know that, the text hasn't told us that, but it'd be really surprising if the word hadn't come to David about the scene we hear in chapter 31 and the follow-up to that. But again, we don't know that, the text doesn't tell us that. So we have to assume, or do we, that David doesn't know this, and when he listens to the young man's report here, he's hearing it for the first time and has to evaluate it on that basis. But if we assume that he does know this report or something like that, then he can plainly see that this is a lie on its face, as opposed to interrogating the details on their own. And as we go through this, we will not ever hear David challenge the facts that the Amalekite reports. Instead, what he'll challenge is killing the Lord's anointed. So whether David believes it's true or David doesn't believe it's true, we don't know. But the man gets killed anyway. Spoiler alert for that. We won't see it to the next video. So with both of these up, and you can see the parallels and the differences, let's go through some of the details here. So as my note below says, the story was not reported by the narrator. Does the young Amalekite think that this fable will put him in good stead, or did the narrator cover up the story? As Polzin, who's so good on these things, notes, we know that the Amalekite is lying, but the story does not allow us to know for sure whether David knows also. This gap in the story is another reminder of how well the narrator has shielded us from the inner life of David. And then further down here, the youth comes to us as he came to David as a personification of David's own motivations. Because as I was noting in the introductory video, and we'll look at it again today because it'll be relevant to a note also from Polzin, one can read this whole story as a little allegory of the Amalekite as David throughout the first book of 1 Samuel, who comes from Saul's camp and knew that Saul could not live after he had fallen. And so there's an element in which we can read it that way, just to keep that in mind. So the young men report to him, I happen to be on Mount Gilboa. So let's look at the word, and then we'll look at Mount Gilboa. So the word for happened, as you can see below, hard to pronounce without the vowels, but with the vowels, Nakurthi, only here in 1 Samuel 28:10 in Samuel, suggesting it's sheer accident. And as one author notes, happen is certainly not a word that David uses, nor is it ever used about him. And further, Malul, whose work on this I've already noted in the previous video, how could any person happen to be on the Gilboa during the battle? Was it a place to stroll around leisurely? Let's take a quick look at it. So here on Google Maps you can see what it would take to walk from the war on Mount Gilboa to David and Ziklag, and Google Maps has two alternative views, but it plainly would take the couple of days that we heard in the earlier verses that it said it took him to get there. But when we look at the close-up of the mountain, this is not a mountain like I experience here in the Pacific Northwest of the United States with snow-capped and hot, rocky crags. This is really just a big hill, and so it would not be that difficult for the Philistine chariots and the horsemen to traverse up that hill. In fact, having chariots, iron-wheel chariots, is one of the things that gave the Philistines advantage, as we saw earlier in 1 Samuel when they controlled or had a monopoly on sharpening iron and iron tools. For both for farming but also for war. So that'll be important in just a moment. So already we can doubt the veracity of this person's report. No one just happens to be on a mountain in the middle of a war, but that's how he starts off. And there, or Vahenab, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear. And it really challenges credibility to think this person, who we don't know much about yet, just happens to be in the middle of the fighting without being a soldier. And it wouldn't be clear exactly which side he's on, is it? So behold, there was Saul leaning on his spear. And if we look at the other report, we can begin to see the differences. So the one in 1 Samuel 31 said, the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by them. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, keeping in mind we don't know how the narrator knows this report, because the armor bearer will commit suicide at the end of this, draw your sword and thrust me through it, so that these uncircumcised may not come and thrust me through and make sport of me. But the armor bearer was unwilling, he was terrified, so Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell upon his own sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons, named up here, and his armor bearer and all his men died together on the same day. Again, we don't know how the narrator would claim to know that, and we don't know if David knows that. But we have to keep both possibilities in mind, that he does or he doesn't. But notice how if David does know this, being badly wounded by the archers is not the same as him standing here leaning on his spear. Apparently not wounded yet, although he will be described so in a couple of verses. And so meanwhile, he says, and behold, this is the second behold of the verse, emphasizing his exclamational tone here to David. The chariots and the horsemen drew close to him. Let's look a little closer here. It's literally the charioteers and the lords of the horsemen here, and echoing Exodus 14:6, where the Egyptians chased them toward the Red Sea, as we know that story. This is going up a mountain, and some scholars have suggested that this is an element of what makes it fictional, that the chariots would go up the mountain. But having looked at Mount Gilboa, again, this is not a mountain covered with boulders or tree stumps. This is, we don't know what it looked like when the story is supposed to have taken place some 3,000 years ago, whether it was forested or not, but still it's likely the chariots could have done that. If it was completely forested, it certainly wouldn't have been the place you would have had a war. Although we'll see later in 2 Samuel, Absalom, retreating after his failed rebellion, will have his head caught in a tree in a forest, so it does happen. So the description is that the chariots and the horsemen were drawing near to him, and this is the note from Samura suggesting that the chariots wouldn't work in the mountains, but that's debatable. So he continues, when he looked behind him, he saw me. Why that detail? Why would the person speaking here, the young man reporting as he's described 3 times, be behind Saul? And why would Saul look behind him? Are we supposed to imagine that Saul is by himself up there? Where's his armor bearer? Where is his troops? Where's anybody else? Where's Jonathan? He'd already told us that Jonathan had died, but where is he in this scene? He's not described in the scene at all. So the way it's presented is as if Saul was all by himself in the middle of a war, and this young man being the only other person around him, which certainly doesn't seem credible. And he called to me, and I answered, here. The sur is not in the Hebrew. This is the third henna of the verse of these little report here in these 2 verses. And he said to me, "Who are you?" And as Polson has noted, this is matching, of course, Saul's 4-fold question to David earlier, "Who are you?" And so to the extent we read this following Polson as an allegory, this is David speaking here to say, in the sense of Saul, "Who are you?" And of course, David's not an Amalekite, but it's part of the allegorical element here. So he says, "I am an Amalekite." And earlier he hadn't said that. Earlier he had said, "I'm the son of an Amalekite, a resident alien," which would give him some status as an Israelite, despite his father being an Amalekite. But here he alleges that he told Saul, "I'm an Amalekite," one of the very people whose failure of you to kill their king has led to you losing your own kingship. So certainly we can't expect that Saul would be happy to find an Amalekite here. From David's perspective, the Amalekites were the people he had just fought against after they had taken all the things from his town of Ziklag and the people, and he'd recovered all those. So neither from David's perspective nor from Saul's perspective would an Amalekite be a good answer, but there it is. So he continues here. And as Joel Baden notes, strikingly similar to the story in the book of Judges about Abimelech in Judges 9:53 and 54. Let's look at that briefly so we can see what he's talking about. Here we see a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Immediately he called to his young man who carried his armor and said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, so people will not say about me, 'A woman killed him.' So the young man thrust him through and he died." And we see the similarity to that here, although it was more similar really to what we see in 31 when he was concerned, when Saul's reported speech was concerned about the uncircumcised might not come and thrust through. We don't see any of that here, that he's concerned about the enemies attacking him. Rather, what he names is he's on the edge of dying, and so just end it for me. So he says to him, "Come stand over me," but literally, "and stand please on me." Similar to the way in Exodus it says that Pharaoh stood on the, in the Joseph story in Genesis, that Pharaoh stood on the Nile in his dream. So stand on me and kill me, for convulsions have seized me. And there's an interesting translation issues here. Hashavats here is only here in the Masoretic text, in the Hebrew text of the Hebrew Bible. But combined with this makes a little wordplay. Seizures have seized me. The seized is used several times, and it used wonderfully ironically, or terribly ironically, depending upon your perspective, in 4:10. We can look at that briefly now, because after this scene, and David is trying to deal with the remnant of the house of Saul, his children, and eventually Jonathan's son, we see this. He's reporting about those who killed Saul's son. "When the one who told me, 'See, Saul is dead,' thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag. This was the reward I gave him for his news." And he uses that as a comparison to justify why he's going to kill the assassins of Ishbosheth, Saul's son. But it's, of course, ironic that in the story of the Amalekite, it's Saul who's claiming that convulsions have seized him, and David will claim that he seized the one who's speaking here and killed him. And yet my life still lingers, which is an odd phrase in Hebrew here. You can see, as Samora notes, the unusual word order, which is literally, "because all still of my life in me." But we get the sense of that here, that his life is lingering. And if we return to the key words, we notice repetition here, not just of the young man who's reporting, but of the simple word "key" here, translated K-I-Y, as you can see there, but used 4 times. It's a form of meaning like "because," but it really highlights how much explanatory material is in the story here. So 4 times in these couple of verses, and it'll come up a couple of more times as we see, not in the poem that David sings at the end, but in our explanatory scene here. So he's almost done, and then we'll look next time at what's David's response. So as Polson notes here, and I really want to focus on this, that this description begins a series. So let's look at his note, and we'll look at my chart, and we'll come back to the verse. He notes, "We have a variegated series of capital crimes revolving around matters of royal succession, with each instance in the narrative series progressing toward an ever more narrow meaning for fratricide. International, intertribal." Here, a non-Israelite who also doubles for David claims to have killed Saul. A couple chapters from now, we'll have intra-tribal, when Benjaminites kill a Benjaminite. we'll see later intrafamilial when David's own son Absalom seeks to kill him. And then we'll see fraternal in the most literal sense, Solomon killing his older brother Adonijah. And we can see that here in this chart, not just what I was showing here, the allegorical story, but the series of these. And I have more in these than Polson notes, because these are not just about that. We see Absalom killed by Joab here, and Joab killing Amasa, and more of it here. So a whole series of fratricidal murders, as we'll see, highlighting perhaps a Deuteronomistic historian, which is the final editor or the author of our passages, ultimate judgment on monarchy that will lead to civil war and family war. How much it'll protect the people from outside enemies isn't clear, but it will certainly create enemies within as people vie for power. So that's going to be one of the themes we'll see throughout, at least from a voice that we can hear as an anti-monarchy voice, or perhaps a pro-David and anti-monarchy voice, but we'll look more at that as we go. So he responds as if he's being faithful to Saul's command. I stood over him and killed him. And notice he doesn't say how. He doesn't say if he stabbed him or what he might have done. He just says he killed him. We don't know that he has any weapons. Did he take Saul's own spear and kill him? We don't hear. So I stood over him and killed him, for I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. So he makes it sound like it's merciful, that he's responding to someone who's suffering and doing his will, the will of the one who's suffering, and killing him. Hopefully, I imagine, expecting he'll get a reward for that, since he certainly must know of Saul and David's struggle. Otherwise, why would he come all the way to Ziklag with this message? And note also that he hasn't bothered to take the dirt off his head for the 2-day journey to make himself look like he just came from the war. He certainly could have shaken the dirt off his head over 2 days. But he continues, for I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. I took the crown that was on his head. And that's an interesting thing, because the word for crown here is nazir, which is not anywhere else in the entire Deuteronomistic history except one example. Apparently, Israelite and Judahite kings did not have crowns, and yet this suggests that Saul has. We've not heard of it before, and we won't hear it again. But the word for Nazir isn't even the word for crown. It's used for Nazirite, someone who's taken a vow, and that's its use in Numbers 6:4-21, where the ORSV translated as Nazirites. In Leviticus 8:9, it is something, some kind of crown, something on the head, but it's Aaron the priest who's crowned with it, not a king. As Polson notes here, the taking the crown expresses his anticipation of a reward and revealing David's hidden motivation behind their shared mourning garb. And further down here from Polson, a dramatic irony that is replayed over and over again in the stories of leaders who publicly mourn the passing of the individual whose crown they wear and whose fate they privately rejoice. And we'll see what David thinks about it publicly after this scene when he gives what's called the Song of the Bow. So he took the crown that was on his head, and the armlet, also a rare word, and only in Numbers 31:50 elsewhere. Its purpose uncertain. It's apparently some kind of bracelet or something you put on the arm, but because of its rare usage, we really don't know what it is or what it symbolizes. Apparently, the Amalekite man thinks it's a symbol of monarchy somehow. And I brought them here to my Lord. And as Gulpaz Feller notes, with this intentional action, the young Amalekite crowns David king, as it were. So I'm not going to continue to see David's response. We'll look at that next time. But as readers and listeners, what are you imagining of this Amalekite's tale? I doubt that any of us listening here would believe it's all true. But why is he telling this? Are there motivations that he can have that I haven't named? We'd inquire about that, because he's in the last moments of his life here. And whatever reward he thought he might get, he's not going to get. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.